This is Kol Yisrael, the Voice of Israel, broadcasting from Jerusalem. Saturday, June the 3rd, 1967, 10 o'clock a.m. An exchange of notes was published in Jerusalem today between Israel's Prime Minister Mr. Levi Eshkol and Russian Premier Alexei Kosygin. Israel's Defense Minister Moshe Dayan has said in answer to a question, "It is neither desirable nor necessary that Americans or British should fight Israel's battles for her." When asked if, should a war break out, it would be a short one, Dayan replied, "If war breaks out, I know that we shall win. That is the main thing." Brigadier General Herzog concluded his summing up of the week with the words,
"When a commander prepares an estimate of a situation, one of the factors which he must analyze is that of the character of the military command facing him. General Dayan's appointment as Minister of Defense will presumably bring in its wake a new estimate by our opponents, and I should not be surprised if a visitor to the Egyptian General Staff today were to find the staff officers there mulling over his Sinai diary. But there are two types of generals in the world: those who continue to fight yesterday's war. They are a national disaster, as France learned to her cost in 1940, and those who think in terms of the next war. The second category characterizes the commanders of the Israel Defense Forces with General Dayan at their head.
This is Kol Yisrael, the Voice of Israel, broadcasting from Jerusalem. Monday, June the 5th, 1967, 8:20 a.m. The military spokesman announces, "The Egyptians this morning launched a land and air attack. At daybreak, Egyptian armored forces started advancing towards the Negev desert. Israeli forces went into action to repel them."
A new chapter in the wars of Israel has been opened. As reported, the Egyptians have launched an attack on our forces and have commenced shelling our settlements along the Gaza Strip border. Nasser has apparently decided to take advantage of the Arab unity with himself at the helm, a unity which evaded him for years, and to act as long as it exists and before it disintegrates. Egypt's satellites, Jordan and Syria, have decided to exert pressure on us in the meantime by aerial and artillery action. But the Israel Defense Forces are deployed and organized to deal with each sector individually, and no doubt these countries will be taught the lesson they so richly deserve. The Egyptians could not have gained much advantage from the element of surprise, as our forces were concentrated and ready for all eventualities. The attacker may gain some temporary advantage by virtue of his initiative, but every attack brings in its wake a counter-attack by the armored fist held back for this purpose, and it is to be assumed that the fist of the Israel Defense Forces will be felt at the spot and at the time its commanders decide on. War is not conducted solely in the field of battle, though this is naturally the most important and decisive element. It is also fought psychologically. And now, in addition to the struggle in the desert sands and the shelling along our borders, a fierce struggle is being conducted in the atmosphere. The fact that no announcements are being made does not necessarily indicate that there is nothing to announce. The issue is being decided in the field of battle, and the shelling or bombing of border villages will have no effect on the final issue. The issue will be decided in favor of the side which gains command of the air, and which is able to destroy the armor of the opponent. It is not always advisable to report on battles, for at times the enemy is interested to learn the facts of the situation no less than we are. Under the circumstances of unprecedented hysteria on the part of the Arabs, their false reporting and utter instability, it is advisable that they continue to believe their own false stories up to a point. Therefore, if I refrain for the moment from reporting the conduct of the war, the reason is self-evident. The fog of war hinders the enemy, and so let us leave him with it rather than dispel it. We think of war in general and abstract terms, but each and every one of us has a personal interest, and deep in the heart a feeling of anxiety for the husband, the father, the brothers and sons now in danger. The young people who have abandoned the cafes of Dizengoff Street and the discotheque, the farm boys, the yeshiva students, the members of the youth movements, the boys of the immigrant townships, All are at this moment shoulder to shoulder fighting in the air, on the land, and on the sea for our right simply to live. A new page has been opened in the history of our people's battles and of the courage of Israel. And deep in the heart of each and every one of us at this moment, when we think of those engaged in the struggle, there is, irrespective of whether we normally pray or not, a prayer that the guardian of Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep.
8:30 p.m. Latest reports tell of Jordanian participation in the attack. In Jerusalem, Jordanian shelling continues into the night. Government House in Jerusalem, the headquarters of the UN Truce Supervision Organization, was overrun by Jordanian forces who were afterwards driven out by Israeli troops. Prime Minister Eshkol announces that the fighting is taking place outside Israel's borders in the Sinai Desert.
The first day of fighting is over, and a new page in the history of Israel's wars has been opened. It is not the first time that many have risen to destroy us. The fog of war covers the battlefield, and we have not taken the initiative to dispel it, for this fog is more of an obstacle to the enemy than it is to us, as it obliges them to be dependent on their own false and exaggerated reports. They have reached new heights in hysteria in reporting to their own peoples on developments along the various fronts, and I am convinced that their internal reporting can be no better. The population quietly going about its work in Tel Aviv and living its day-to-day life will be interested to learn that the Arab broadcasting stations report that the city is burning fiercely. This gives some indication as to the accuracy of their reporting. King Hussein today made the mistake of his life because he believed Nasser's false estimate in regard to Israel's weakness and inability to stand up to all the Arab forces at once. As to the results, we shall wait and see. To summarize the situation at the time of this broadcast, a decisive battle is being waged in the south, according to the Egyptians in Sinai. The Egyptian Air Force would appear once again to have met its match, though the battle continues. And as I have explained more than once, we are organized and capable of handling any grouping of problems posed to us by the Arabs at any time. A few days ago, Nasser said that Israel today is different from what it was 10 days ago. I would say that tonight Nasser is a very different person from what he was when he started work this morning.
This is Kol Yisrael, the Voice of Israel, broadcasting from Jerusalem. Tuesday, June the 6th, 1967, 10 o'clock a.m. The Chief of Staff, General Yitzhak Rabin, and the Air Force Commander, Brigadier Mordechai Hod, report on the results of the first day's fighting. The Chief of Staff reports that in the Sinai area, Israeli forces have captured Rafiach, Sheikh Zued, and El Arish. One armored column is already on the road from El Arish to Abu Agila. And the lead story of the day, Israel's Air Force has dealt a decisive blow to the air forces of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, and has gained air superiority in the entire region. A total of some 400 enemy planes have been destroyed.
I began my broadcast yesterday by stating that a new page had been written in the history of Israel's wars. And indeed, a brilliant new page has been added, not only to the Israel war record, but also to the annals of military history. When the Chief of Staff characterized the victory of the Air Force as without precedent, these were not mere words, but a very accurate description of a brilliant operation which will be taught in all Air Force schools throughout the world for generations to come. I feel that we are justified in using Churchill's historic words about the Royal Air Force after the Battle of Britain, that never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. A war takes place in phases. Yesterday morning we witnessed the defensive holding phase, when the Israel Defense Forces quietly and efficiently held the Egyptian attacks and chose the point for the major counterattack. We then moved over swiftly to the counterattack phase, with the Air Force fighting for complete mastery of the air by destroying the enemy forces. At the same time, the iron fist of the Israel Defense Forces moved into counterattack with armor and infantry. A very wide breach was opened in the Egyptian line from Khan Yunis in the north to Qusayma in the south, and the forces advanced along two axes, the northern and the central. In the meantime, our forces in Kuntilla in the south began to operate, and the enemy is faced with the problem of determining where our main effort will be. Now the main struggle, namely of armour against armour, will take place. With mastery of the air in our hands, there is only this phase before a decision is made in the field of battle. The Egyptians have begun to tell stories about American and British air support of our forces, but this will be of no avail to them. This time we shall finish the war on our own. But in my view, this Egyptian announcement may already testify to the breach of their front line and even indicate an intention to withdraw. Jordan yesterday commenced operations, and the account is now being settled by Central Command. North of Jerusalem, our forces cracked open the strongly defended line near Ma'aleh HaMishah, and our forces are advancing. To the south of the city, we have gained ground in the Sur Bachar area. At Latrun, the Israel Defense Forces settled an old account. Familiar names from the War of Independence, Nebi Samuel, Radar, Jenin, and so on, rise to the fore. In these places, the flower of our youth fell in 1948. The Israel Defense Forces are now avenging them. In conclusion, a brilliant day has come to an end, the results of which have astounded the world. We enter the second day of fighting, confident in ourselves and in our strength, for it transpires that this generation is maintaining the traditions of the generation that won the War of Independence and the generation that fought in Sinai.
2:00 p.m. The town of Gaza fell at noon today, and earlier Bir Lachvan, southeast of El Arish. During the night, Israeli forces have captured the villages of Nebi Samuel and Beit Iksa in the Jerusalem area, as well as the Latrun region. This morning, the village of Shuafat, close by Jerusalem, also fell into Israeli hands.
Our forces continue to struggle on all fronts, and in the sands of the Sinai desert, they are exploiting the wide breach which was created in the enemy lines. There, our army is fighting to smash the Egyptian army, which entered Sinai 2.5 weeks ago with the purpose of destroying us. This battle is the most important for us and will decide the results of the war. All yesterday, the Jordanians attacked our towns and settlements, including the capital city, all along the frontier. They shelled our citizens indiscriminately. Hussein has apparently completely lost control of his forces, who are now gun fodder for Nasser. Perhaps the Jordanian people now appreciate this fact, but it is too late. History is changing with giant strides every hour. Our forces reacted yesterday evening to the Jordanian aggression and broke through the ring of defences in the north of the corridor and in the south of Jerusalem in the Sur Bachar area. This morning it was announced that Shuafat is in our hands, which means that we have smashed the main line of defence, a very impressive and formidable line which the Jordanians had created in the capital city. Latrun has fallen. Jenin has fallen. The main routes of advance have been opened, and the Israel Defense Forces are now sweeping all before them. When our troops moved up last night to Jerusalem, they passed the armoured wrecks in Shar Hagai, left as a memorial to those who fell in the War of Independence. Perhaps even these lifeless shells of steel experienced some emotion when the armoured units of the Israel Defense Forces passed by. I have no doubt that the souls of the boys and girls who fell in them marched with our forces as they moved up to the city. And now the struggle continues. I am broadcasting from Jerusalem to the sound of heavy shelling. A strange form of quiet and anticipation has fallen along the front line, a quiet that may foretell great tidings. An army of reserves has been engaged in the struggle since yesterday against the Jordanian forces. Slowly, methodically, and with great bravery, the forces under Central Command carried out their tasks. These hours may yet be among the greatest in the history of our people for thousands of years. Every man and child will retell the story of these times until his dying day. For we have been privileged to live to see the armies of Israel, with the Lord of the hosts of Israel at their head, poised before the gates of the eternal city.
8:30 p.m. In the south, Israel forces have taken Abu Aguila and Jebel Libni. In the north, Syrian artillery is shelling the settlements of Shamir, Lahavot Bashan, Kfar Sold, Yesod Ma'ala, Gadot, Kfar Hanassi, Chatzor, Rosh Pinah, and Ein Gev. On the central front and in Jerusalem, Jordanian artillery fire continued throughout the night and morning almost unceasingly. Jordanian shell fire was also directed at the settlements of Ramat HaKovesh, Bochan, Tzur Natan, Lahav, Yad Chana, and at the Tel Aviv area. Israeli forces have taken the Jordanian gunnery position at Kalkilia. In Jerusalem, the French heights have fallen. The road to Mount Scopus is open.
The second day of fighting has now ended, and it would appear to me that all world records have been broken. Our Air Force, in a most thorough and brilliant manner, has created a situation which must be the fondest dream of every military commander. The Sinai Campaign of 1956, which entered history as a swift battle, assumes almost slow-motion proportions in relation to the current one. It is only 36 hours since HR, since the Egyptian aggression commenced, and behold, our forces are well and truly established within enemy territory. The Arabs have always promised us a blitz war. They failed to keep their promise, and instead it has fallen to the Israel Defense Forces to demonstrate the correct technique to them. In the south, we caused the enemy heavy losses in armour, and I trust that this time, with complete air superiority, we shall succeed in preventing the enemy from withdrawing their armoured forces to the Canal Zone, as is their wont, and destroy the armed forces of Egypt once and for all in the interests of peace in the area and of world peace. Jordan was the power which brought the full impact of the war home to the doorstep of many of us. Since yesterday morning, their forces have been pouring fire of all types into the capital city of Jerusalem and on settlements along the frontier, and have been using long-range artillery to shell targets in the heart of the country, including the city of Tel Aviv and Lod Airport. These operations were in addition to air attacks against border villages and an infantry attack in the Jerusalem area. The events emphasized for every citizen the intolerable situation created by such an armistice line with an ill-intentioned enemy. And indeed, steps have been taken to make corrections. Today, Kalkilia, from which area Tel Aviv was shelled, was taken. Heavy fighting broke out all along the frontier of the triangle, and it continues. And now the dull explosions of mortar shells and the staccato sound of small arms is heard throughout Jerusalem. The hourglass of events is filling up, and each one of us is living this moment of history. Generations of Jews for thousands of years to come will think of us, of a small and privileged group of Jews in the state of Israel, who lived and created this moment replete with historic significance for the Jewish people as a whole.
This is Kol Yisrael, the Voice of Israel, broadcasting from Jerusalem. Wednesday, June the 7th, 1967, 4:30 p.m. The military spokesman announces, this morning the Israel Defense Forces penetrated the old city of Jerusalem. Sharm el-Sheikh has been captured. The straits are open. The Chief of Staff announces that the entire Sinai Peninsula is in Israeli hands, as is the greater part of the west bank of the Jordan, the old city of Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Hebron, and the Etzion bloc. The Air Force commander announces the destruction of 441 planes belonging to Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq.
The miracle of our generation continues, as does the brilliant campaign, the like of which there is no record of in the history of Israel, and perhaps in the history of the nations, and which has achieved today what millions of Jews throughout the generations have prayed for. Our entire attention and our hopes were concentrated on the liberation of Jerusalem, but let us not forget for a moment that the main and decisive battle has been conducted in the Sinai, where our forces destroyed the retreating armies of Egypt. The Straits of Tiran, which were closed before Israeli shipping only 2 weeks ago, were opened by the Israel Defense Forces, who captured them. Our sea link with Africa and Asia has been resumed, and we have once again proved to the world that there is only one language that is understood by dictators. Slowly but surely, the old city of Jerusalem was besieged, and the people of Israel waited spellbound and in anticipation of great events. As I stood today beside the general officer commanding the central command by the Wailing Wall, I was reminded that there is sometimes justice in history. In 1948, Mount Zion was captured by the 4th Battalion of the Palmach, which broke into the old city at Zion Gate, but which was later obliged to withdraw from it. That battalion was then commanded by a man who is today Brigadier Uzi Narkis, commanding the central command of the Israel Defense Forces, whose units captured the city and earned the gratitude of generations. And indeed the saying goes, Jerusalem is a gift of the whole land of Israel. On the altar of the Temple Mount and Mount Moriah, the people of Israel offered up today priceless sacrifices which swell the toll of sacrifice by earlier generations. Our victory was not lightly achieved, and at this moment it is well that we remember those who offered up their lives for the glory of the Almighty and the nation. Jews for generations to come will recount the tale of this day, of these people, of its army and its commanders, and will remember us, the privileged ones, who united as one people, who suddenly discovered that there are more important things than day-to-day dissension, who rose to the call of the hour and turned their backs on that internecine strife which had brought about the destruction of the temple, and who lived to see this great moment. And in the words that Shakespeare put in the mouth of Henry V on the eve of battle, and gentlemen in England now abed shall think themselves accursed they were not here. At this holy moment in the history of our people, silent generations of our people are looking at us tearfully and gratefully, generations who were massacred and slaughtered, and who offered up their lives for the glory of the Almighty, our sons and daughters, the silver tray, who gave us our state. They all thank our generation for not having forsaken the destiny of Israel. This is the day which the Lord has created. Let us rejoice and be happy in it.
This is Kol Yisrael, the Voice of Israel, broadcasting from Jerusalem. Friday, June the 9th, 1967, 8:30 p.m. Syria continues shelling settlements along the border. Israel forces continue their efforts to silence the Syrian guns. Syria's President Noureddin el-Atassi broadcasts an appeal to the Syrian people and troops to repel an Israeli invasion at all costs. Syria's Prime Minister claims at the United Nations that it was Israel who launched a full-scale land and air attack.
It appears to me that there is no precedent whereby a military commentator wishing to make a weekly summary is in fact summarizing an entire campaign which took the world by storm and which has already become a legend. A week ago, the Arab armies bordering on Israel were concentrated along our frontiers in preparation for our destruction. They were deployed with at least 250,000 troops in the field, some 2,000 tanks, and some 500 first-line aircraft, a large and impressive force within the context of our region. They were under a single command and united in a pact with one single and solitary purpose, to destroy the state of Israel. They enjoyed the complete support of a major world power which supplied them with false information as to Israel's intentions. Their concentration along the frontiers were accompanied by an uncontrolled psychological warfare in which we were assured, each and every one of us, of a bitter and horrible fate which would befall us, our women, and our children. The world was horrified and hesitated and held conferences and listened to speeches and engaged in diplomacy and made proposals. In the meantime, the Egyptian dictator became a captive of his slogans, and with him his satellites in Syria and in other countries. King Hussein made a wrong estimate of the situation and placed his forces under Egyptian command, an act which was the fatal error of his life. The Israel Defense Forces were deployed in 3 regional commands, organized and ready to operate simultaneously and independently in all the commands if necessary, a fact which was apparently not obvious to the enemy, and here he erred again. The enemy, the world, and if I may say today, many of the citizens of the State of Israel did not appreciate the significance of the war machine that had been built by the Israel Defense Forces, based as it was on a civilian rear which adapted itself overnight to the requirements of war, and did not understand correctly the capabilities of the military force which had been built here in Israel. For years, since the Israel Defense Forces were organized, its commanders who brought it to this point planned the army and its organization, its weapons and its equipment, its training and the fighting spirit with which they imbued it, to meet every possible military contingency which might face its generals. In 3 days, the world saw the result of years of meticulous work, of intense efforts to raise a generation of military leaders who would be capable of leading the troops in a bitter and brutal war to victory. But if the battle in Sinai was a purely military battle, that against the Jordanian army was in fact a very Jewish battle. The wars of Israel from the days of Joshua until the War of Independence were re-fought, and our glorious history came to life again before our very eyes. Fighting an enemy who fought with tenacity, the Israel Defense Forces smashed his defenses and liberated the West Bank up to the Jordan. Bethel, Nablus, Givon, Hebron, Bethlehem, Jericho, Shiloh, the Etzion block. It was as if a page had been taken out of the Bible, and we were privileged to live to see it. And finally, with supreme gallantry, after the ring had been closed around Jerusalem, one of the elite formations of our army broke into the old city, captured a Temple Mount, and restored Israel's crown. These boys, the finest of our youth, who had been through much in the field of battle, wept like children, they and their officers, when they reached their holy objective after a costly and bitter struggle. Thus ends a war which the history of mankind will recount for generations to come. The people of Israel have lived through days which are among the greatest in their long history. The Jewish people who stood steadfastly and loyally by our side understood the significance of Israel for themselves and are experiencing today a national Jewish pride greater than ever before. I am broadcasting these words from Israeli headquarters, which but 3 days ago was Jordanian headquarters. From my window I look out upon the mount of the temple, and once again the armies of Israel guard the city wall over which the flag of Israel is flying. A burnt-out Israeli tank lies on its side before a gate in the wall, silent testimony to the price which our people paid. May we be worthy of this price.